Good evening. My name is Jose Valde, and today I'm going to share a story that happened to me when I was a child living in the small town of Bacherite. At that time, my family was humble, and my father worked hard on the farm. When we needed supplies, he would make a long trip to the town center to buy what we needed. The journey was made on a cart pulled by our little donkey, and I loved accompanying my father on these trips. I would always climb onto the cart full of excitement while my sisters stayed at home helping my mother. Going to the market was always a highlight for me. We would leave before noon to make it back before dark. The journey was long, and the path was filled with landscapes that, to my child's eyes, seemed magical. Green mountains, crystal clear streams, and the songs of birds accompanied us along the way. When we arrived at Mr. Francisco's store, my father would start buying the items we needed. Meanwhile, I would arrange the purchases on the cart, and Mr. Francisco, always kind, would give me candies. That was the best part of my day. On one of these trips, my father announced that we needed to go to the market, and I ran to the cart as excited as ever. After harnessing the donkey, we set off. The journey there was peaceful as usual. However, something different was about to happen that night, something I would never forget. My father always told us not to touch anything when we left the house, a strict rule he enforced to avoid accidents or trouble. I knew this well because once, when I leaned against a glass display, I ended up breaking the glass. Fortunately, the store owner, a kind man, didn't want to cause any trouble, and my father, relieved, didn't give me the beating I feared. That lesson stayed with me. That day, we left for the market at our usual time. We arrived, and everything went as usual. My father bought the goods, chatted with Mr. Francisco, and I arranged the bags on the cart. I received my candies, and soon we were ready to head back. The night was beginning to fall, and we took an alternative route that Mr. Francisco had suggested, saying it would be quicker. We entered an unfamiliar path, a dark road surrounded by tall trees that seemed to form a tunnel. The darkness began to envelop us, and the moon barely illuminated the way. Suddenly, a shine caught my eye at the roadside. It was an intense glow, as if a jewel was lying there on the ground. Curiosity got the better of me, and I asked my father to stop the cart, saying I needed to urinate. My father, concerned for our safety, told me to hold it in, but curiosity was stronger. As soon as he was distracted, I jumped off the cart and ran toward the shine. My father, startled, shouted for me to come back, but I kept going. When I got close, I saw that the object was a small silver crucifix, reflecting the moonlight almost hypnotically. Without thinking, I picked up the crucifix and put it in my pocket. To cover up my actions, I pretended to urinate, but when I looked up, I saw something that chilled me to the bone. A grave at the roadside, overgrown with weeds. The tombstone was weathered, but it was clearly old. My heart raced, and a sensation of chills ran through my body. I ran back to the cart, terrified. My father was angry but decided not to beat me there, saying he would deal with it when we got home. Sitting in the cart, I still felt that strange chill, and something seemed off. It was then that I took the crucifix out of my pocket and noticed that it was glowing intensely under the moonlight, an almost supernatural glow. At that moment, something even more frightening happened. Out of nowhere, a deep, eerie voice echoed through the night. "Where are you taking me?" My father and I exchanged horrified looks. The donkey started to panic, nearly tipping the cart over. The voice was masculine, deep, and seemed to come from all directions. My father, eyes wide with fear, began to pray aloud, asking for protection. The donkey bolted, and my father struggled to control the reins. Fear gripped me, and I started to cry. The voice repeated the question, and each time it spoke, it seemed closer and more threatening. Panic set in and the road seemed endless. My father continued to pray, and in the midst of the chaos, I remembered the crucifix. With trembling hands, I took it out of my pocket and threw it out of the cart. The moment the crucifix hit the ground, we saw something even more terrifying. A shadowy figure emerged from the darkness and bent down to pick it up. It was a man, or what looked like a man, shrouded in a dark aura. He picked up the crucifix and vanished into the darkness. Fear paralyzed me, and my father began to shout, asking God to protect us. The journey back home was a mix of relief and terror. The voice disappeared, and silence returned. We arrived home in the early hours of the morning. My mother, worried, was waiting for us at the door with a lit candle, praying. We told her everything that had happened, and she was shocked. Fortunately, my father, perhaps out of fear or exhaustion, forgot to give me the beating he had promised. I didn't say anything about the grave or the crucifix, keeping it as a dark secret. Since then, I never touched anything that didn't belong to me, especially in unknown places. I learned to respect what we don't understand and not to mess with things that may belong to others, especially if they are no longer among us. This story stays with me to this day, a reminder that there are things beyond our understanding. Good evening, my name is Yul de Souza. I am originally from Além Paraíba, a city in Minas Gerais that borders the state of Rio de Janeiro, but I currently live in Uberaba. I'm not sure if people will take my story seriously, as what I'm about to recount is hard to comprehend. Even I can't explain how something like this is possible. Nevertheless, I will share my story. I was born in 1970, and like most young people who lived on farms, I helped my parents with work from a very young age. This was the reality for many who lived in the countryside, and I was no exception. Throughout my childhood and youth, I lived with my parents and siblings on our property, located in the rural area of the municipality. In the 1980s, when I was already a teenager, nearly a grown man, I would go to town with my father 2 or 3 times a week to deliver some products that my family made on our farm and sell them in the local market. The road that connected our property to the town passed by the old Simplicio railway station, which was already in ruins at that time. I grew up hearing stories about supernatural apparitions at that station, and it always frightened me whenever we passed by. When I was 17 years old, my father asked me to go to town driving our pickup truck to deliver our products for the first time. That day, he was feeling unwell and stayed home. So it was just me and my younger brother, Mateus, who was 15 at the time. We left home in the middle of the afternoon and only finished the deliveries after 6 p.m. After that, we stopped at a shop for a snack and then headed home. Part of the road ran parallel to the tracks, and the car's tape player was on. Even so, I heard a very loud noise outside, as if a locomotive were coming down the track. However, the line had been deactivated for many years. So, I turned off the tape player, but my brother was annoyed because he couldn't hear anything. I stopped the car, and suddenly, a light appeared, like a headlight, moving along the tracks. When it reached the old station, the light simply disappeared. My brother didn't see the light either, and I felt a knot in my throat. I was terrified and had a bad feeling, but thank God, we managed to reach our property, about 3 kilometers from the station. When I got out of the car, my legs were shaking. I ran inside, and my mother gave me some water. Meanwhile, my brother said it was all in my head. Since only I had seen the light and heard the noises, I noticed that my parents were unsure if it really happened or if it was just my imagination. They just calmed me down, but I trembled every time I thought about what I had seen. Over time, I began to think that maybe it was all just a creation of my mind, influenced by the stories of apparitions that so many people told. I continued with my routine, trying to forget the incident. Sometime later, on a Friday, I went fishing in the late afternoon with my brother and a cousin from Juiz de Fora. Since the distance was short, we decided to go by bike. We took flashlights, machetes, hooks, some food, and drinking water. We stayed by the river until around 10 p.m. We had caught a lot of fish and decided to head back. As we approached the station, my brother, who had always been mischievous, stopped his bike because the tire was flat. My cousin and I also stopped, leaned our bikes against the fence, and helped him fix the inner tube. While we were almost finished, my brother looked towards the station and, with a mocking tone, said he wished he could see a ghost there since many people claimed to have seen one, but he had never been so lucky. At the moment he said that, I got upset and asked him to stop, as it seemed like he was mocking me and what I had experienced years before. Then, suddenly, there was a loud bang, like a thunderclap, but the sky was clear. In fact, it was a full moon, providing plenty of light. At that moment, I couldn't understand what had caused the noise. A few seconds later, I saw the lights at the old station again. They hovered in the air like lanterns. From the distance we were at, I had the impression they were the size of a soccer ball. My heart raced, thinking I was losing my mind. But when I looked at my cousin, his eyes were wide open, and he was trembling with fear. He ran to grab his bike, but at that very moment, we heard voices of people talking. I looked at my brother, who was calm and said it must be someone fishing, passing by the station. I've always been afraid of these things and was convinced it was a ghost. However, my brother left his bike against the fence and walked towards the station, determined to prove there was nothing unusual there. Despite being terrified, my cousin and I followed close behind. As we approached within about 20 meters, we started hearing a strange noise, which immediately reminded me of the same locomotive sound I had heard before. This time, I wasn't the only one who heard it. My cousin also heard and was shocked. Then we saw something incredible. It was as if the station was still operational. We heard footsteps moving through the ruins, but they certainly weren't from people of our time. We saw shadows dressed in old-fashioned clothing, carrying suitcases and looking happy. The scene was like a glimpse into another era, a glimpse into a long-gone time. The most incredible thing happened next. The people, or what seemed like people, exited the station toward the tracks and slowly disappeared. The sounds grew distant until they could no longer be heard. Everything lasted about a minute, but it felt like an eternity. The lights went out, and silence enveloped the place. My brother, who had been so brave, was speechless. I noticed tears running down his face. We rode our bikes back home quickly, with my cousin and brother far ahead of me. When we arrived, we told our parents everything that had happened. Deep down, I felt relieved because, this time, everyone saw it, and it wasn't just me. The good thing about all this was that I discovered that, despite being frightening, the ghostly apparitions didn't seem to want to harm us. I lost my fear, and after that, I often saw the lights nearby and heard noises as if the railway was still operational. But I knew they were just forgotten souls, seemingly continuing to live their daily lives from the past, not even aware that they had been dead for a long time. Good evening. My name is Reinildo Oliveira. I live in Morada Nova, in the state of Serra. I was born and raised here, and if God wills, it will be here that I leave this world because I am passionate about my land. It was right here in the rural area of the municipality that I had an experience with a supernatural creature, the kind most people doubt exists. Therefore, those who go through this type of experience prefer to keep it to themselves to avoid becoming a laughingstock. But since I have no doubts about what I saw and I don't care about the comments, I decided to write to you to recount this experience. Everything happened in the year 1996. At that time, I was 17 years old. I was always a handsome and flirtatious guy, and I got a girlfriend who lived on a farm about 10 kilometers from the town center. I prefer not to mention the girl's name, but I want to make it clear that we are still friends to this day. Although our relationship didn't work out, our friendship remained. So much so that when I go to Fortaleza, I visit her house. At the time of the incident, we were schoolmates. Even though we saw each other from Monday to Friday, I used to go to her house on Sundays or holidays to spend time with her. Her parents, Mr. Paolo and Mrs. Amelia, liked me a lot. They were friends with my parents and didn't mind our relationship. On the contrary, they encouraged it. When we broke up, Mrs. Amelia cried a lot, but that's another story. Back to the account. In November of that year, Mr. Paolo had a birthday and decided to slaughter some animals and have a foro party in the yard of their house to celebrate. Besides being a good person, he also knew how to play the accordion and loved to party. We celebrated until after midnight. My parents also went to the party, but since their car, a Boxy GOL, only fit 5 people, I preferred to go riding a motorcycle I had at the time. Around 11 o'clock at night, my grandmother started to feel tired, so my parents decided to leave. Since the foro was lively, kicking up dust in the yard, I decided to stay longer. When the party began to wind down and the guests started to leave, I realized it was time to go. The remaining guests were local residents who lived on nearby farms and villages. I, being the only town resident, wasn't afraid of much. I said goodbye to my girlfriend, her parents, and headed home. After about 2 kilometers on the road, the motorcycle went into reserve. My heart froze because I imagined being stranded at that hour of the night on a road where not a living soul passed. I went back to my girlfriend's house to get some gas. Since Mr. Paolo was still drinking beer, I ended up staying a bit longer. Time passed, and when I finally headed home, it was already late at night. Then, as I approached an old, abandoned house by the roadside, I felt an uncontrollable urge to relieve myself. I stopped the motorcycle, got off, and while I was relieving myself, I heard a loud noise, like a bang inside the house, which had no doors. The night was clear, with a full moon shining brightly, and I saw someone coming out of there. From a distance, I couldn't see clearly, but it looked like a tall, strong man. What caught my attention were the eyes, which glowed like torches of fire. At that moment, I started the motorcycle, and with the headlight, I realized that the figure's head was like that of a dog, but much larger, like a gigantic German shepherd. The feeling I had was that someone was there, dressed up, ready to rob me or worse. I thought to myself, now I'm in trouble. I put the motorcycle in motion and accelerated as fast as I could. I noticed that the figure didn't chase me, but I only relaxed when I reached the town. When I got home, my parents were asleep. I didn't want to wake them, just stored the motorcycle and went to take a bath before going to bed. My street was full of dogs, and as soon as I lay down, they started barking uncontrollably, more than usual. Then, I heard a loud, deep howl, different from any dog howl I had ever heard. A chill ran down my spine, and my heart raced. I didn't have the courage to leave the room to check what it was. The next day, I mentioned it to my family, but, incredibly, no one had heard anything. It was as if it was a dream, or rather a nightmare. After that, I avoided returning from my girlfriend's house at night. When I went there on Sundays, I would return while the sun was still in the sky. Over time, the fear passed, and I ended up forgetting that feeling. During the holidays, at least twice a week, I stayed at my ex-girlfriend's house until night. But when it was 8 or 9 o'clock, I would hurry, grab the motorcycle, and go home without stopping on the road, praying that the motorcycle wouldn't break down. In early February of the following year, Mr. Paolo, Mrs. Amelia, my girlfriend, and my 2 young brothers-in-law went on a trip to Fortaleza. They stayed for a week visiting relatives and resting. Mr. Paolo asked me to take care of the farm, feeding the animals. As a request from him was like an order, I promptly accepted. One night, I told my parents I would spend the night at the farm. My father suggested I take a friend to keep me company because you never know. I invited a friend named Goodo who was also a schoolmate. Besides helping me with the chores, he would keep me company during the night. We stopped by his house around 3 in the afternoon, bought a bottle of Montilla Carta Auro and soda at Mr. Raimundo's bar in town, and headed to the farm. When night fell, we made a meal to eat and stayed on the house porch, drinking and listening to music. At that time, many in our generation were still mourning the death of Renato Russo, so we played his tapes and records non-stop. Mr. Paolo had a gradient stereo, and we turned up the volume to the maximum. Then, when the tape ended and we were about to switch it for another one, we heard a howl identical to the one I had heard months before on Mr. Paolo's birthday night. Not a single hair on my body didn't stand on end. We ran inside the house, locked the doors and windows. My legs were shaking like a leaf. We turned off the lights and stayed in the living room, me with a knife in hand and Goodo with a skewer. We stayed in silence, listening to our own breathing. Minutes later, we heard a noise, like someone had jumped over the farm gate. The footsteps approached the house and stopped in front of the door, already inside the porch. Tears streamed down my face because if whatever was outside came in, we were lost. Luckily, we started hearing dogs barking approaching. Mr. Paolo's farm didn't have dogs, but the neighbors had many. Soon, it sounded like a war of barks and howls. Meanwhile, Goodo and I were frozen with fear. Minutes later, we realized that the thing on the porch ran away, and the barking diminished until it disappeared. Exhausted, we eventually fell asleep. When the sun rose, I woke Goodo, we got on the motorcycle and left, not daring to stay there any longer. When we got home, I told everything to my father, who believed me. He started accompanying me to the farm to feed the animals. The following week, the family returned from Fortaleza, and I told them what had happened. They didn't say whether they believed me or not, but since then, I never went back on the motorcycle at night, fearing to encounter that creature again. I still believe that the creature I saw on the road followed me home and went to the farm just to show me that it knew where I lived. If it wanted to, it could have harmed me because I was there alone. If it really wanted to enter, I wouldn't be here telling my story. Good night.